Hello everybody, in this video series I'm going to be showing you how I made this Roubo Workbench. Right, so in this video I'm focusing on constructing the top. Little side note here, if you have eagle vision you might notice that the legs are incomplete in the background, even though I completed them in the previous episode, sort of. That's just the way I'm editing this series, by doing it in categories as opposed to chronological. Just makes it a little bit easier for people to navigate the videos and find subjects they want to know more about or want to re-watch or whatever. So as a quick recap, at the end of the machining video I took all of the ends of the workbench top to the radial arm saw and cut off all the manky bits of grain and all the bits of paint that are left on at the sawmill, just to give me a relatively flush edge to work from. This was going to be cleaned up later on, but I just wanted a more defined edge to work from here. Okay, so to joint these layers together, I had three options basically. First one's just a straight up edge joint, glue it straight onto each other and try and get it all lined up by eye. Problem is, with a lot of these boards are still moving around a bit, so that's quite a risky thing to do because I'm going to be forcing a lot of them into positions they don't want to be in, and trying to get those glue lines flush will be a bit of an issue. Next one, or next choice, was a biscuit. Now, these are primarily made by Lamello, I suppose, but you know, you've got lots of different choices. These are good for, in my eyes, for thin panels and stuff like that, where you don't have a lot of space top to bottom, and you just want to get the locations spot on so it's flush top to bottom. However, something this sort of size, I'm wondering if that could be a bit of an issue, where there's going to be a lot of tension in this top, and these, perhaps being a little bit fragile, might, I don't know, I don't think they're going to have the holding power necessary for something like this, so get rid of that. Final option, Dominoes by Faithfull. Now these have kind of the same function as a biscuit, just they're a lot more robust basically, made of solid beech as opposed to compressed like these Lamello ones are. And yeah, I think that these should have the holding power necessary to keep everything aligned and not risk breaking apart in the future. Gives you a bit more of a gluing area as well, sort of deeper into each of the boards as opposed to sort of in the edge of them as well. So this is the one that I'm going for. It's just going to be a bit more expensive. So similar to what I did on the legs, I also planed a small hollow between each of the layers on the top as well. Planing a small hollow just allows the edges to close up first, and as a result focuses more of the clamping force on the visible parts of the joint as opposed to the bits in the middle that are hidden. This doesn't affect the overall thickness of the boards whatsoever, because you still have those outer edges as your reference point as established by the thicknesser. So it's not going to affect any of those leg joints or anything like that. It's just simply to close up the joints a bit easier and make it look a bit better. Now I was very fortunate to have access to glue rollers here, which are primarily used for veneering at Rycotewood, but I thought I'd nick one for this. Works absolutely amazing. I'm using Cascamite here. Like I said in the previous video, it's got a longer open time. It's also gap filling, so if there is any small hairline gaps or anything along that top, it's going to fill them out nicely and match the colour of the wood, and you'll be none the wiser to any of it. So yeah, applied it liberally to both surfaces, filled up the domino holes with it, shoved the dominoes in, stick those layers together, flip it over and do the same on the other side and make a stack of 3 of them, and then stick 2 of them together and then stick a batch of 3 and 2 together to make 5. The reason I did it in batches is because Cascamite was going off a little bit quicker than expected because of the heat in the workshop, so I just wanted to take the stress out of it and do it in 2 separate glue ups. With all the 50mm components glued together in 2 sections, I could then move on to the thinner sections where the mortises were due to be shaped. Marking in from the end that I cut relatively flush on the radial arm saw, I gave myself a little bit of extra material to cut off at a later date and started marking out the wedged mortise on the 3rd layer in. So remember in the last video I said that I marked the shoulders of the legs in 20mm to the tenon. On this mortise, I marked it so the bottom of the tenon was 20mm in from the top of the tenon. It's not actually marked out in a ratio as you would normally do with a dovetail joint, or a dovetail shaped joint in this case. So the outer part of this wedged mortise layer isn't really that important, like I said, because I can just cut the ends flush at a later date. This middle part of it, however, has to be absolutely spot on between the 2 layers, because it's what dictates if the frame is going to be square or not underneath the workbench top. If one of these was slightly longer than the other, then it would mean that the front stretcher would be a different length to the back stretcher, and it would also throw the outer stretchers to be into a, what's the shape? A pyramid with the top cut off. A trapezoid, that's the one, trapezoid. Don't want that on the underframe because not only does that make mortising an absolute pig, but it also makes the tongue and groove slats a nightmare to fit at either end. So to cut the angles on this layer, I used the table saw. Angled the fence on it, and this angle was derived from the CAD drawing I drew of the overall workbench. Also double checked this with a sliding bevel and a really accurate protractor just to make sure it was matching the drawing. But like I said, this angle comes from the 20mm offset from the bottom of the component to the top of the component. Consequently, that angle would change depending on the thickness of the top. So the reason I drew a pencil line on that middle component to cut them to the same length was because using a stop can be a little bit inaccurate on the table saw. When you've cut the wedge on one side and then flip it over to cut the other side, the wedge can kind of hook itself underneath that stop on the table saw that I'm adjusting now. As a result, it makes the overall lengths a little bit off, so having a definite pencil line to work to was the easiest way to do this, and just nibble away little bits of material and sneak up to it. The reason I'm adjusting the stop here is just so I have something to push the wood against, but I'm not relying on it to cut the thing to its final length. So that line you see me lining up now is where I established that I wanted to cut the workbench to at a later date. So I'm lining this component up to that and then marking on the locations of the dominoes. I couldn't use the same spacing as the 50mm components because some of them clashed with the mortise hole and it would just be pointless putting one there. So I had to remark them out for each layer, and again gave myself a little bit of side-to-side adjustment to get everything aligned at the end of it. To get the mortise a nice and tight fit on this layer, I created a spacer that was the same width as the tenon. Pop that against the end component, shoved the middle layer in and marked out my domino locations. Again, a little bit of wiggle room so I could snug it up to that spacer. Clamp that in place and then repeat the process for the opposite side once it had all dried up. So in those previous clips I was gluing the back layer on, and I did a bit of a stupid here and glued the front layer on as well. This layer was meant to hold the dog holes. Luckily I spotted it before I glued the rest of it on, but that end one was meant to be drilled before gluing it on. So that was a bit stupid. I don't have any dog holes in that area now. I'll wait and see if the need arises for me to drill them in by hand at a later date, but until that point I'll leave it bare. So the dog holes, how did I drill them through this component? Well, took a bit of experimentation, a bit of questioning on social media. The overall winning strategy was using 3 different drill bits, which I'll explain as I go along. So here I am lining up the fence with the centre of the component and the brad point on the end of the forcing bit, make sure it hits it all centrally. I mark that centre line using a marking gauge. I said centre way too many times in that sentence. Oh god, centre, sentence. Let's get that as well. Anyway, the Forstner bit wasn't long enough to go through the entire component, and when you start putting extensions on it, it can cause the Forstner bit to wander. I want these to be perfectly plumb through the whole component. So the Forstner bit was used to establish the first few inches of the hole and make it nice and smooth through there, because that's the bit that you're most likely to feel. This was with a fish wave cutter, so it's really nice, you can't really fault the finish left by it. Now what some forums and articles recommended at this point was to finish off the rest of the hole using an auger bit. That screw thread would help pull it through. However, look at the wiggle room left at the end of it. They're both reputable brands, Fish and Wood Owl. You can't fault their machining, but it's just the way it is. There's a little bit of play in there. Now me being incredibly anal about it, I didn't want this, so I got a long beam drill and then drilled out the rest of the holes all the way through to the bottom. You can't use an auger bit in a drill press because the screw thread would engage in the material, and I don't even know what would happen. I assume it would just rip the wood upwards and probably clap you in the face or something like that. But if you drill out the centre of that hole first, it gives nothing for that screw thread to engage in, and you can use the Forstner bit like a normal drill bit. And when you're drilling it out with the auger bit, make sure the material's lifted off the table, because once you drill through, that screw thread is obviously able to engage in the bed below. And that would, I don't know, it'd probably destroy the chuck, to be honest. So raise the wood up. I just double checked it was all square then, which it was. Then that gives you clearance for the screw thread to break through the bottom of the material without engaging in anything and breaking everything. Now with that wedge tenon layer glued on and the second layer in also glued on, so you can see those wedge layers are all trapped in now, I got the top relatively flat with the jack plane, just got rid of any small ridges, and then this would make it flat enough to go through the drum sander. I'm incredibly lucky to have access to one of these throughout this project because it keeps the accuracy completely 100% while I'm still assembling it. I don't doubt I'll be able to flatten it by hand once I have it all glued together at a later date, because I've obviously orientated all the grain in the same direction as well, so that makes it a bit easier. But this saved a lot of the legwork while making it. It was just a bit of a cumbersome thing to get through, I suppose. That is all the top glued together bar the final layer. That big hole you saw at the front there was space for the wagon vise to be attached at a later date. And that is it for this video. The next one will be focused on jointing the underframe, or sorry, creating the underframe I suppose. And I will see you then.